All right, here we are, finally. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. How are you doing, whoever you are? Are you finding the patience needed to get through your day without totally losing it? Here's the situation. You see, I've been sitting here for the last hour waiting for my neighbor to finish with his gas-powered snowblower. And don't get me wrong, it's a really cool thing. He didn't just do his driveway, he's doing the sidewalks. You know, the old guy across the street is doing the snow blowing for the block. And I'm appreciative. I appreciate that. However, it's pretty late in the day and I got to get this intro recorded. And I'm looking out the window and I'm watching him. And he couldn't be doing it in a more inefficient way. You know what it makes me think of? Back when I had this yoga center in Brooklyn, I remember for at least the first year, maybe the first 2 years, but at least the first year, I basically did everything. So at the end of each day, I dust mopped the floor and, made everything right and did all the bathroom stuff, put the paper towels, all that stuff. I did it. And then at some point, a few years in, we started what do we used to call it? Work study program. They used to call it the Karma Yogis, but I never liked that. I always called it the work study program so people could do stuff around the center in exchange for classes. So I started a program of people coming in to help with stuff. And I remember the day I was showing the Karma Yogi the routine that I did at the end of the day to sort of close up and clean up everything. And I was demonstrating how I did the dust mopping. And I had a way that I did it where, you went up and back and it was what I thought was like the most efficient way to do it. And I was showing them how I was doing it. And then the person said, "Oh, well, I don't need you to show me how to do the dust mop. I can do the dust mop, Jay. Don't worry about it." And they grabbed the dust mop from me and they proceeded to do it in a totally different way where they started going around the outside perimeter of the room and then working their way sort of, I guess, concentric squares all the way into the middle, which made no sense to me. And at some point, I was about to say to this person, "Oh, don't do it that way. Do it the way that I do it." And I caught myself and I said, "Wait a second, Jay, does it really matter if the floor gets dust mopped? Does it matter whether that person does it the same exact way that you do it or the way that they have the impulse to do it?" And I didn't say anything. And it always stuck with me, There's lots of different ways to dust mop a floor. And there's certainly a lot of different ways to snow blow a neighborhood. But in this instance, my neighbor's inefficiency has also pushed me much later into the evening than I was hoping to be. But he's done now, and here I am, so let's let it go. Let's let it go. I hope you're managing your little life annoyances as well. I've been reflecting quite a bit on the episode I put out a few weeks ago where I talked about the crossroads that I'm at and where I think the larger yoga world might be at. I got a lot of feedback about it. It seems like I hit a nerve and a lot of people are thinking about these things. And a big part of it seems to me to be about people reevaluating what they're doing and why. Like the same reasons we had for busting ass to be a yoga teacher back before the pandemic doesn't make sense anymore. And wanting to have more clarity around what is my purpose in doing this? What makes it meaningful for me? Why do I care so much about this that I would struggle in the ways that I have to in order to make it my life, And one of the things that I've identified, which we've been talking about here on this show, is that there's something that happens when people come together with mutual intention and attention, and there's some improvisatory space that gets held, and these virtuosic, improvisatory, divinely inspired moments seem to occur. And that's really the thing that makes it feel magical and important. And being able to talk about that is just not so easy, especially when you're trying to talk about it in sort of like a market, in like a mainstream business yoga market. And we're trying to talk about these subtle nuances. It's not like we're all sitting around a Bodhi tree contemplating things or doing practices together. I'm on this podcast, and yoga teachers are out there doing retreats, and people are selling mats and all of it, you know. So finding people I can speak to about what I consider to be the subtleties of what transpires in these practice spaces is what I've been really focused on. And it just so happens that my guest today, Weena Pauly, is someone who's been doing that for as long as I can remember. In fact, Weena, I know her from back in the days in Brooklyn. I was just talking about the center. That's when I met Weena. And I won't spoil it because we talk about this at the beginning of the conversation, but I had some experiences with her that made an impression on me that really connect to what I've been, you know, considering these days in terms of improvisatory spaces and why I think that's important. So, as it often happens here on the show, there were some convergences, and the timing of my reconnecting with Weena could not have been more perfect. It was lovely to speak with her, and it's my pleasure to be sharing it with you today. Real quick before we get to it, let me mention this just in case you don't know. I imagine some of you are already aware of this, but I have a feeling there are others who don't, because for a long time, this show had an archive that was completely behind a paywall. So the most recent 52 episodes of this show are always available in their full length on this public feed. But up until not so long ago, all of the other 350 plus episodes were behind a paywall, and you had to be a premium subscriber to listen to them. Well, not so long ago, we changed that, and we made the whole archive first half free. So all those episodes that were completely behind the paywall in the past, you can now listen to the first half of them. And some of them are really long. So, you know, the first half free versions are still, 45 minutes to an hour of these conversations with all of these incredible people and all this history and all this philosophy and all this amazing stuff. So I didn't like the way so few people were getting a chance to listen. So we made everything first half free. And I am hoping that if you're able, you would also support the show with a premium subscription. That way you would have access to the entire archive in its full length. But in the meantime, you might scroll back through the archives and see what's there. There's a bunch of stuff, and I wanted to make sure that people knew that. And if you want to connect with me in ways outside of listening to the show, if you want to get into some practice, or you want to participate in my weekly discussion group, or maybe you want to get in deep with the teacher training program, you can find all of my stuff at jbrownyoga.com. Okay, I think that is fine. I will touch base with you on the other side, but let's go ahead and listen to this conversation that I had with Weena Pauly. Hello? Are you there?
I'm here.
Hi, Weena.
Hi, Jay.
What is going on?
Oh, man.
I'm traveling back in time.
Right?
Right?
I'm trying to think of when I've actually laid eyes on you in the flesh.
Oh gosh, it's been a lot of years.
A lot of years.
Let me mention, I don't know if you listened to the show, I'm already recording, and if it's okay, I want us to think of ourselves having just begun. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Well, I don't know. Are you in the same apartment that you were in back in, say, 2000? No, you're not still there. Are you still in Brooklyn, or did you move away?
I'm in Queens.
Oh, all right. You're
Jackson
still there,
Heights.
though. You're still in the area.
I'm still in it.
Found another place. You had to find another place, I'm sure. Well, let me say a few things to you, because there's really some really lovely convergences that happened in getting ready to speak with you today.
Okay.
And I think it sets us up for kind of some of the things I thought we might talk about. And, it's so funny to me, because I was thinking, well, why have I not reached out to Weena to have her on the show? I've been doing this podcast for 8 years, and I've tapped all the people, you know what I mean? Anybody I could think of. You know what it is? I know you started a podcast recently, so I know you know what it is to reach out to people you think you can have a good conversation with,
Yeah, right.
And I'm like, why did I not think of it? And I didn't really come to an answer until I was getting ready, because I think now is the right moment for me to be speaking with you. And I don't know if it had been previously. And part of that had to do, well, first of all, just shout out to Nick Beam, because he's how I'm on his email list, because I just think he's a really smart dude. After he came on the show, I got on his email. So that's how I found out you were doing a podcast. I listened to that episode, and I was like, oh my God, this is kind of perfect. So one of the things that I've been talking a lot about pretty much this whole year, but more recently, especially over the last few months, has to do with what are yoga teachers actually doing in their teaching? Because there's been a lot of stuff about, when you and I started practicing and first met, you were affiliated with this particular lineage tradition, and there was these guru masters. And a lot of that has come into question, and even people who were in those traditions for a long time have moved away from them in certain ways because of all kinds of things that we've talked about on this show too. And I started doing an online teacher training for the first time last year. I swore them off after Abhyasa, which is where I met you, and I was doing the teacher training there. I just swore them off. I was like,
Teacher trainings or online?
Teacher trainings. I was doing online teaching, but the idea of a 200-hour teacher training or that whole kind of model. And I just felt like I was just giving all this information, and I didn't think that it was really how I became the yoga teacher that I wasn't through somebody just taking me through some already thought up curriculum of prepared information that they're going to download into me, or even structured practicums of teaching examples. But I had to find it all, and the teachers kind of helped me or something. And so I'm getting to you because one of the conversations recently has really been around how much of what teachers do comes out of an improvisatory space where things happen that you didn't plan. The best teaching moments are almost always not in the lesson plan that you might have came up with, but it's in these little moments where you're released into what's happening in a certain way, or you're reading the subtle currents of what's happening in the room and you and the other people. And things happen. I've called them virtuosic improvisatory moments.
Nice.
And then that's when that person comes up after and was like, can you record what you said for me? And you're like, I don't even know. I've never even said that before. You know what I mean? You can't even really always source where that came from. So we've talked about that in terms of morphic resonance. Maybe you're tuning into some kind of universal wisdom or whatever. Or more recently, I was just talking about it as an intuitive process that happens, and just kind of owning that, how much of it is intuitive. So all of this is a roundabout way to say my memory of you is you giving me a free 1-to-1 Phoenix Rising yoga therapy session in your apartment. Do you remember that?
I vaguely Yes.
You were doing some teaching at the center. You were kind of like, I can groove with your thing, but you were also heavily into the Phoenix Rising stuff at that time.
Yeah, right.
And you were like, let me give you, I don't want to talk to you about it, you said. You should just come to my apartment and we'll do it.
So mysterious.
But totally appropriate, because I remember what I took away from it, and what I believe I said to you at the time was, oh, I get it. Like, you didn't come with a prepared thing that you were going to give me. You just showed up to be present in a certain way and try to listen to what would make the most sense, or what might be helpful to me. And it was very much on me to be, it was all totally invitational, back before everybody was talking about invitational language. And I remember really like, oh, that's very interesting. And I took that away. And it's certainly something over the years I've come to recognize as part of what I do as a teacher, is just show up, and that those best classes are the ones that I didn't plan everything. And nowadays I don't plan shit. I don't plan anything.
Yeah.
And then you
Isn't
feel
that
like,
nice?
I know it does take a load off, but it is a process, and I'm intrigued by that process. And when I was getting ready to talk to you, I saw that you were kind of framing it around the idea of impulses.
Yes. Yeah.
So first of all, before we get into the nitty gritty, that was this substantive intro to what I want to get into. I first just want to catch up a little bit, because I know that you and I both ended up having some children and doing some family stuff. Have you been teaching and keep holding it down and managing, or did you take some time away for a while? Like, I saw you started your podcast recently. Why haven't I had you come across my radar sooner? Is it newer that you're getting back into stuff, or?
Well, most recently there was a shift. I've never stopped, actually, dancing or working. Maybe, I guess, after my first birth, I took about 3 months off. But I realized rather quickly that I was a better mom if I was engaged in my work, whatever it was, if it was creating or making or moving or something. But the podcast came about completely as an experiment. It still feels like an experiment. So that's why, because everything recently shifted towards this work that I call SEAM, which is Somatic Experiencing with Authentic Movement. And so the podcast was an exploration of impulse through a different context. So what happens if we step into a conversation completely unprepared, without any agenda to hit on anything or arrive somewhere or discover something? And what is the encounter like between two people? What impulses show up between them? And then what's it like to stay with that, or pursue it, or let it guide us? And the tricky part is it can be really boring, actually. It can be, it's not edited. Like
sometimes stuff doesn't come. That's what I was saying to some folks the other night. We were talking about this, like this process, intuitive process. And I'm pointing to these moments where you say something virtuosic. That's not what it is all the time. Sometimes you're just like going through the same thing you've gone through a bunch of times before. You're like repeating things again and again and again.
Or waiting.
And it isn't the glamorous, glowing moment, but it's still the same part of the process of inviting those moments, right?
And I would say that for me, the conditions for that kind of emergence are best when it is the field of not knowing. When I'm in a water of like, I don't know what's going on, and I can really be like, okay, I'm going to hang out here. That's when I feel like I've created good conditions for what's actually happening to surface. And so in the conversations, that was part of what I wanted to risk. I wanted to risk being boring. I wanted to risk the mundane and, like regular ass banter between people, to just see what happens and changes through time. I also was interested in a longer format, so I don't put an end time to those. We just, when we're done, like, how's that feel? Like, what does it feel like to actually be done without an external clock telling you you're done? So that impulse, even to finish, was part of how we end. And we start every podcast doing some nonverbal practice together. So it's been really fun. I'm starting to understand it, and I can't necessarily get my hands around it, and I don't know where it's headed. And I've never looked at the stats. I don't know if anybody ever listens to it. I've just enjoyed the people that I've been with, and that's why I keep doing it. So.
Well, I appreciate it. I've listened to an episode or two and I enjoyed them a lot. And I've certainly taken a lot of those elements. As you know, I purposefully don't write out questions, and I try as much as possible when we're like, there are times where it's okay because we all have little scripts that we've come up with as teachers, you know, and I don't have any problem with that, but I want to get us off scripts too, wherever possible. Because like I was saying at the beginning, just like in a yoga class, like in a conversation, often those moments, if we can sit with them, if we're not nervous enough, if we could be with the silence enough together, then the things emerge that are really always the most fantastic. In my experience, I always want to invite that. So I've certainly done that here on this show, but it's nervous. People know, you know, we're recording and they know it's going to go out. And so you don't want to say something that you don't want other people to hear, but I think of it like you do as a practice in the same way that you would show up to have a yoga practice with someone, in the same way you did that one-to-one session with me. It's kind of like an exercise in like walking your talk as a teacher in a way, to like just show up and be with you right now and talk to you in the moment, having not talked to you in years, but like no time has passed, you know?
And part of what makes it, I said the conditions for not knowing, but I also must be clear in that there's a container for the not knowing, because endless not knowing is actually kind of anxiety producing. It's not like forever, but the container, and actually in that session that we shared with Phoenix Rising, there is a structure, and it's actually the way that I work inside SEAM is I provide actually quite clear and sturdy containers, because I've found that the more sturdy the container, the more freedom the content. And so part of what happens inside SEAM and even in these exchanges is there's a sturdiness, or at least some clarity to knowing to what extent I cannot know, to how far can I fill out this space, and how much freedom is there in this, knowing I'm going to bump up against the structure at some point. I feel more free. And that's true for making dances and making classes and sessions, that it's always for me this that dance between really clear container and the risk of not knowing what's inside yet.
Yes, I agree. I was talking about that with someone earlier about that as well, how there's all this stuff that you do in practice, like all that stuff they talk about, like developing sustained attention, or being able to kind of like be more embodied and be able to like have proprioception and sense what you're feeling, or get messages, what your body's telling you it needs, which we could talk about because I know that's something you talk about. But like, there's all this stuff that you would have done as a practitioner or a teacher that sets a stage for the facility of being able to kind of be in the moment enough and allow that intuitive process, or to be aware of the impulses and know which ones to deny or which ones to follow, as you say, you know, like that. There is work to set up a container, as you say.
Yes. Yeah.
Before you then have and you need to kind of repeat it again and again and again. Yeah. When you say sturdy container, what do you mean? Like, for me, what I've done, and you know this, although it's changed over the years, like a repeatable, simple program of asana that I kind of stick to all the time, that people are allowed to change in whatever they want. But they know what's they know what's coming. I'm not throwing curves at people. Has been a kind of way for me to have some sort of stable container where people kind of know what they're coming for in terms of the forms. They know what I'm about in terms of they don't even have to stick to the forms. They can do whatever they want. But what do you mean when you say sturdy containers? Because I know somatic movement modalities are often more about improvisatory movement.
Yeah. So for SEAM in particular, the containers are time and roles. And so those get described very clearly. So time would be, we're going to do this practice, each person for 5 minutes. Then we're going to share for 3 minutes each. Like, it's very kind of, I don't want to use the word strict, but it feels that way because that feels good to me. But other people have a different.
There's a plan.
Yeah.
This is the plan.
Some people bristle around, and we talk about our reactions to compartmentalizing time like that. That's another practice, which is how do we determine those times? But so it can be time. And then inside the time is the roles of mover and witness. And those are described through what your task is, what your agreement is with your partner. Outside of that, those 5 minutes, outside of that, we don't know. So those are the containers that are established in SE+AM. But I think containers can take all kinds of forms. And if you really get more kind of, I guess, philosophical about it, everything is a container, really. So, for example, I just made a 2-woman show, and our whole challenge after doing improvisational dance for 11 years, coming from a very traditional, trained, technical background, that was the edge, was improvising. So we did it. And now the edge is actually making choices and choreographing every single moment. Terrifying, right? Mm-hmm. But those are the containers now. Now the container is, you do this on that count. You do this on that count. You move here then. And inside each one of those moments, you can fill out with as much aliveness as you want. So I would say containers are incremental, and you can describe them in any kind of way.
I think that's true. And I suppose it depends on like how you come to the containers and how tightly you hold to them.
And their function.
Yeah. Like if you spent all that time letting yourself be improvisatory. I always thought that was interesting as someone who did some of that, like postmodern dance stuff in New York City in the 90s. I had some of those folks on. We talked about that time. There was like that really incredible time where there was like a dance scene, a postmodern dance scene in New York. And I was going to contact improv jams at like that PS1 whatever school over there on Avenue A or whatever it was. And I remember that those spaces for improvisatory movement were very exciting and formative. And I guess giving yourself that experience and then deciding that, I want a tighter container and I'm going to like choreograph a thing and work within it is very different than feeling like the containers are imposed upon you.
Mm. Yeah. truth be told, I hated improv. Like through college and actually through the 90s that you're talking about. Like I would actively avoid contact jams because what I valued was form. What I valued was technique. What I valued was craft. And, even though anytime something has that kind of charge, it's going to pull you in at some point, right? So after, I guess it was after Streb and then Brian Brooks, but it felt very edgy for someone to say, okay, you have 10 minutes, improvise. Because my mind would short circuit and like, to do what? Like, what am I doing? What is this for? What do you want to see? How do I organize myself in this open space? And what it took a long time to figure out was that inherent in that quest was a lack of value. Sort of like for myself. That in fact, I felt that I needed to understand how to meet the expectation in order to be valuable, in order to create value. Mm-hmm. And if the expectation wasn't clear, then there's no value to what this is. So it took a long time of like unwinding and going through these layers and pulling them apart to find what I talk about so much in SE+AM, which is, what if you didn't do anything? Like, what if you just stood there and let somebody look at you? That's very scary. very intimate to not perform or give you something or show you what I can do or express a story or make meaning. If I'm just inhabiting myself, being alive, is that valuable? And so we kind of meet up against those edges of nothingness. And then again, like that space of not knowing or being inside the vulnerability of really just being seen as a alive human here. If I can find the ability to stay with that trembling discomfort or edge, something starts to happen. And it happens for both the mover and the witness. And it feels incredibly profound to me. And it shifts what becomes permissible. It shifts what how I show up. The perceptions, the energy of the room. I got people coming on to talk about energy healing because there's that shift. You can feel it when it happens, right? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. It's very moving to me. I just ran an intro to SEAM yesterday, and it is, I'm always like, I always think it's weird and nobody's understand this and like, why am I doing this? This is crazy. Also, like, why don't I just get a real job? You know, like that happens probably weekly. But then you run an intro.
That's why I'm talking to you right now. Because here's the thing. A lot of yoga teachers, especially over the last few years, you know, everybody had this weird, like the world fell apart thing happened and everybody's picked up the pieces. And yoga teachers, I just think, have come to this place where they've been questioning what they're doing. Like I said at the beginning, you know, like, what am I really doing? And a lot of teachers, like you just described, myself included, even though I was doing slow and simple, it was still about form. I was still, when I look back at the teacher trainings I was doing in 2012 and 2013, it's hours of me with my shirt off demonstrating the forms for everybody. I would never do that now, but I thought that I was really giving important information, and maybe there was some helpful stuff in there, but it was this emphasis on form, even with a more quote unquote therapeutic orientation. So to let go of that and move toward what you were just talking about, which is a very profound thing. It is more about an experience that you're having with people, or I even sometimes have framed it in rituals because it's a little bit easier to kind of grasp what we're doing. Because that's the hard thing for folks now. They're trying to go out and bring some of this stuff that they've explored, these more somatic approaches. And it's like, how do you even tell somebody what this is? Like,
I know.
You know what I mean? How do you invite somebody into this like subtle inquiry that you so eloquently said? I've often said like the subtle inquiry into the nature of your existence compared to like a handstand workshop.
Which has its value. Like form has its place. Like God bless form. I don't have anything
against handstands. They're great. Yeah, that's why I come into the marketing is like a marketing thing, because there is you putting it out there. Like you want to let people know that this is the work that you're interested in doing. And I guess there is a pressure for someone like me too, where like you are relying still on it to like make your living. Not everyone is. So depending on how much of like your livelihood is tied into the pursuit, I think that affects it a lot as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. And I mean, two things I want to say. One is that I really had to spend time questioning my love of form for a long time and understand what form I was in love with and why. And what started to occur to me was it wasn't domination over the body isn't quite right, but there was definitely an aesthetic that I was driving towards and guiding towards that is white, Eurocentric, body, probably more ballet alignment, long limbs, straight legs, like form, technical dance form almost, that I didn't even know I was crafting towards constantly. And it took a long time for me to pull form apart and be like, wait, what is this for? And I remember Leslie Kaminoff was like, form is like, can you breathe? Right? Is this?
Yeah. Does my knee really need to be over my ankle? Like that.
Right.
Thing.
Exactly. Right. And then I started getting interested in like, what if you just let the body, let impulse, decide form? can we trust? Because I think anytime we're opening up a not knowing space, an improvisational space, inherent in that request is some level of trust, right? You're trusting that something's going to happen, something will show up, or nothing. But there's
a value to doing that, right?
Exactly. And so part of it was like a reclamation of how my body wanted to move. Not how it should move, not what would be good for it, not what would balance it out or make it more mobile or strong, blah, blah, blah. It was like, what does my body want? What wants to happen? And then through doing that over time and repeating that so much, I remember leaving days of doing a lot of authentic movement, and I have never felt more integrated, more whole, more mobile, more strong and fluid than anything I've ever done before. And I was like wildly confused that it was not because I was applying form at all. I was just allowing my body to unwind or sometimes it's sounding and jumping and quite active and crazy, or pressure, or like strength, or sleeping. I fell asleep in an authentic practice, literally while someone was watching me. Can you imagine how boring? But like, what level of intimacy and vulnerability is allowed to happen at that level? I mean,
is that what authentic movement is? Like listening to see if you can hear what your body's telling you what it wants? Because you hear people say that a lot, like listen to your body, or what does your body want? And I don't know that a lot of people really know what that means, or, like, what are we talking?
And can we separate?
Because it's not thinking. Body? It's not like, it's not like thinking that, I'm going to think. You can't think your way into that. That's a feeling thing. Right?
Yeah. And I don't have the answer. I think listening to our bodies means something different for every single person. I don't even know if I understand what that is. I mean, Nick was really valuable in pushing me to really explain the difference between an impulse and not an impulse, which everything is an impulse at a certain point, right? If you wait, there'll be another impulse.
I guess that's interesting, because I don't usually use the word impulse, but it makes sense, because I don't think there's like all these impulses in me that I have to control or stop to keep me from doing all these things I don't want to do or be. Like, I don't see it that way. I do feel like I mentioned, there's moments, and I think a lot of teachers have had these, where you have done your work as a teacher, let's say, and you've showed up to the class in the way that you want to show up. And there's that improvisatory, virtuosic moment where it feels like something came through you.
That's impulse to me.
You would call that an impulse.
So impulse has a lot of baggage.
Yeah.
Because we put it with impulsive.
That's right.
Like the nature.
You're too impulsive.
Right? Control that shit. Right? Like, it's very, impulse has a real, a sort of a wildness to it, or a lack of control. Or I think there's a lot of associations. Impulse for me is, and this is from your teaching, breathe out, get to the bottom of the exhale, and wait for your body's request for breathing, and then respond. That's impulse.
That's the primary impulse of your existence, isn't it?
Yes. So there's that tangible impulse. And then I think there are other impulses. And what I get curious about is how impulses create patterns. So an impulse for survival, an impulse towards connection, an impulse that happens towards protection. Those are constantly part of our nature as animals. And the behaviors and patterns that are formed around those impulses kind of give it a pathway. And I think if you can locate the impulse before the action or the pattern takes hold, there's a little more freedom or choice there. Or at least the opportunity to experience the impulse before it's moved into an action. Does that make sense?
It does. I never use the word impulse, but I've often thought that there's a certain kind of self-observation or awareness that you cultivate, and you can sort of see, this pattern that is you, this pattern that has become you, or whatever. And then that sometimes puts you in a position to have a little bit more say about whether or not that pattern is going to define you. Like, I don't think I can get rid of the patterns. Like, they're kind of in there, but I can create new, better patterns that replace patterns that I don't like so much.
Maybe.
And I do think I've often said it, even just in terms of like yoga practice and having some facility with your own mind, that like you get to have some say about what your mind does some of the time, you know, like, and that's huge. That it's not like you get complete control. And that's why I think impulse is a word that we have associations around, because it does kind of have this idea of it being like a negative or like you're controlling things. But I get what you mean, that it is something, an impulse that you have even to decide to be a yoga teacher or to do this stuff. Like when people just feel like a calling to something.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I define it as a spark toward aliveness.
Yes. I remember when Lauren Roche came on, he talked about meditation being that. Like, what are the things that like light you up and that like kind of the muses, you know? But it's interesting to me that, and this is what I talked about someone recently, John Sturck came on about, like, when you're going to make your teaching about exploring what we're talking about here, it is a kind of subtle thing of how to invite people into that, because it isn't culturally valued or even like acknowledged. And how much do you come up against that? Like, are you getting people who already know what you're about, or are you coming up against people who are like very far away from it and having to be introduced for the first time?
That's a good question. I mean, I think authentic movement as it stands on itself does not need somatic experiencing. It's an incredible practice on its own. It's used all over the place. And I would say movers are familiar.
Is there somebody who's behind that? Who's the creator
Mary
of that?
Starks Whitehouse. Yeah.
Okay.
Mary Starks Whitehouse created authentic movement in the 50s. And it sort of moved from there to Anna Halpern. There's a whole sort of lineage, and it's through the dance world, honestly.
Okay.
And then moved into dance therapy. A lot of choreographers use it for content or movement generation. It's used lots of different ways.
And is it like a real system, or does it have like I imagine a set of principles or like forms? Like, how structured is it?
There are no forms around movement at all. There are forms around roles, like I said, through roles of witness and mover. And it's also in spiritual circles too. So we can get to that. It can move into, it can sort of inhabit these different spaces really well. The reason and I'm getting to your question, the reason I sort of brought the somatic experiencing frame to it and language and lens is because I found that it grounded the practice and made it accessible for non-dancers and non-movers and opened it up to a conversation around survival patterning. And so in a way, that was one doorway I made to talk about this, to invite people in to experience it. I don't use the word trauma very much at all, but, and I don't call it trauma healing, but the people who are in that world, and who are familiar with nervous system work are curious about like, oh, this embodied movement practice. And I think it feels safe because there is a real attention and awareness around survival patterning and the language we use in somatic experiencing. So that's one way I'm able to talk about it that I think can feel more grounded, or I can point to more research about so people can feel perhaps a little clearer about what it is. But yeah, it's hard to talk about. But don't you think most great things are hard to talk about?
Yes, I do. And, I will say that it does make a lot of sense. And I did talk about this when I had my friends from the postmodern dance world in the 90s on, that a lot of yoga teachers have utilized different somatic movement modalities because of the language. Like, they have their own languages to help try to communicate about these sorts of things. Like, I know, like, a lot of people utilizing body Bainbridge Cohen and body mind centering. I remember like having these conversations with Amy Matthews at the Breathing Project, about like this very conversation of like, she had this such lovely way of offering the forms of just like, oh, can you notice this? Can you notice where your knee is? Can you find different places your knee might be and which place feels the most strong to you. And like, if I was like really present and with it and like really in an improvisatory space, I was like, wow, absolutely. People will find the best place for their knee better than I could tell them ever. However, like when I had this center on Metropolitan Avenue off of Lorimer, and, you know, I had an A-frame sign out and 100 new people were walking in who were like, hey, I want to try this yoga. And they're thinking about a million things. And I'm like, hey, do you notice where your knee is? And they're like, what am I going to get for lunch? You know, they're not even, like Leslie would say, the prana has to be in the body first. Someone has to be interested and able to kind of show up in the way that dancers show up to explore things in their bodies sometimes.
Yes. So and that's where form comes in.
Yes,
right?
That's what I was going to say. Is there things that you would do with people to help set those conditions that are needed for that?
Yes. So I often will say, and I mean, well, we'll start with the biggest one, which is safety. So virtually the way it runs is the person who's the mover closes their eyes. So there's an immediate safety concern, but we're online. And I don't know if you've noticed, but like depth perception is off on Zoom. So you think the like water and vase of flowers is right next to them. In fact, it's quite far. So there was a little bit of a learning curve in how to be the witness of a mover and provide safety for your person online. In person, that's one of the roles, is to make sure they don't run into the wall or another body, or you're physically keeping them safe. So that was one way. But online, I had to just say, movers, you're responsible for yourselves. So look around before you close your eyes. But I would say that is some kind of form that offers them some level of safety. I have not run into many people who are really thrashing or going to some sort of bodily extreme that requires intervention. I guess it's possible. But because I talk so much about the focus of being seen and seeing as the crux of what we're doing, it's a relational practice. There's so many layers of inhibition they're already working through that, like, I'm just
imagining people like eyes closed, someone watching you. Cause I know like sometimes even just the other day, last week, and this is so funny because the way things come around, you know, and there's synchronicities. Like I had someone show up to my class in person. It doesn't happen that much, but I have a little space. I can only fit like 5 people in there. But I had someone show up who'd never been to a yoga class before. And that just hasn't happened for me in such a long while. But both that person and the person who brought them, who's I think relatively new, if I wasn't demonstrating, they stopped. Like even after I did the first round or two with them, like they like literally needed me to be giving them like a visual example of what to be doing.
Wow. I mean, I will say that I don't think I know what's best for people.
Oh, yes. Everybody take note. Everybody listening, take note to Weena's. If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of Jay Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.